Welcome to the Autism in Black podcast, where we focus on all things autism and the Black parent experience. Our goal is to always educate, support, and empower parents to advocate for not only their children, but themselves. Hello, and welcome to the Autism in Black podcast. I'm Maria Davis-Pierre, a licensed mental health counselor in the state of Florida and America's #1 autism advocate for Black parents. I'm the founder and CEO of Autism in Black, Inc., where we aim to include the excluded. Today, we have Patrinia Baksmaty. She is an education disability inclusion strategist. She is also the founder of the Kaleidoscope Collaborative, which is a disability-centered equity design consultancy that leverages innovative community partnerships to bring disability-inclusive learning experiences to public elementary schools. She is also a Harvard-certified universal design learning practitioner. Patrinia is also a speaker at the 3rd annual Autism in Black conference happening this weekend, April 28th through the 30th. In this discussion, we talk about some of what she will be presenting on this weekend about universal design learning, as well as how she got started into advocacy and how that led her to open her practice and do the work that she does. If you would like to get a ticket to the conference, please look in the show notes and click the link to go to the registration page. Enjoy today's show. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Autism in Black podcast. We are here with another speaker of the 3rd annual Autism in Black conference. So we are super excited for this episode, and we are here with Patrinia. Patrinia, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me on.
I'm so excited for this podcast. We've had a little bit of a conversation, so I know what this conversation is going to entail. So I know our listeners are really going to enjoy it. So I've already read your amazing bio, but can you tell us something that we didn't know from the bio and things that you really want us to know about who you are and the work that you do?
Sure. Well, I mean, one thing anybody who knows me personally knows is that I'm deeply rooted in raising children, and not just my own children. I just love kids. In fact, talking about how much I love it brings me to tears most times. It's a passion that I've had since I was a kid. And I remember identifying for myself that I wanted to work with children when I was probably like 6th grade, maybe around 12 years old, that it was something I wanted to do. And what I wanted to do was, in my mind then, it was help the quote unquote troubled kids, right? My parents used to watch those talk shows. Some of your listeners will remember, like, I'm dating myself, but like Sally Jesse Raphael, what is it, Geraldo? Yes, those shows that were on, and they would sometimes have those episodes with the parents who would bring out the troubled kids. Mm-hmm. And I would be watching those shows over my dad's shoulder, my mom's shoulder, and I always felt very empathic with those children for whatever the reason. And I'm an empathic person. I'm a Pisces, if anybody's listening. But I always felt that I understood them beyond sort of, the checklist of behaviors that were appropriate and maybe the school setting that they were having challenges in. And that part of me is still very much alive. And I find it so interesting that it has been activated through my now parenting neurodiverse children, and having to find a path for them in traditional school settings, just always having to be a pioneer and understand them, study them deeply in ways that our established institutions either cannot do or just won't do. And so I find that youthful connection is still with me, and it drives everything about what I do. I would do what I do for free. Because that's how much a part of me that it is.
I love that. I think when we have a personal connection to what we do, it kind of changes the drive on how we approach it.
Yes.
I know for me, the reason that I do what I do is because of my children, right? Because I want to make it easier in some way for them. And in turn, I'm, impacting multiple lives because I want to make it easier for them. So when we have a personal connection, I think the advocacy is a little bit different. I want to talk about the story behind your work as a disability inclusion strategist. Can you tell us about that?
I will. And let me give a disclaimer to your listeners because I am currently in Ghana. You and I discussed this.
Yeah.
I'm currently in Ghana, and I am sitting in my mother-in-law's dress shop. So you may hear trotros and other vehicles coming to Ghana, riding by every now and then, but just enjoy the visual scenery as I'm talking. But so my story, I'm sure is just like yours and many other parents who would be listening. You've read my bio. I have a background well before I became a mother of, working in schools, teaching. I've opened charter schools, in California. I was co-head of a school for gifted children in Houston. I did what I now look back and see is quite a number of things. I had a number of really great experiences before becoming a mom that I know now really prepared me for the children that I have been blessed to raise. And so I have a 9-year-old daughter who has some, I would say, mild dyslexia. She's dyslexic. I have an 8-year-old daughter who is autistic and also hyperlexic, which I find is a new term for most people. And she's also has it's a pretty severe speech delay. And I have a son who's 5 who is neurotypical, and probably, if you're going to go with labels, because it's not always necessary to use these labels, but I would say he's more maybe the GT end of the spectrum. So I call us neurodiverse, but my work with Kaleidoscope Collaborative really came out of what I had to create for them during COVID when schools closed. And my oldest was in first grade, doing virtual first grade. My middle child was doing virtual kindergarten. And my last child, who was only 2 at the time, was just a toddler running around the house because his preschool had closed. And I had to pull together my skill set with project-based learning. I brought in an ABA, in-home ABA therapist who also had a teaching background. And I learned quickly from my verbal kids that they wanted to be together in their learning. We initially tried dividing them up, this child will learn in this room, that one. And they were like, no, we want to be with everybody. They wanted to be with Fariel, my child who doesn't really speak, as fluently. And so we collaborated, me and the in-home therapist created a lot of project-based activities for them to do, which I think are easy to accommodate in terms of the different skill levels for each child. We worked a lot with my neighbors. I know my neighbors well, our corner stores, the local Walgreens, the Chuck E. Cheese, they've known us. And so we could go out and do some community-based learning. And I remember talking to my mother-in-law about it. She was calling me from Ghana at the time, just checking in on how things were going. And I explained what we were doing. And she said, you have a kaleidoscope of kids in your house. And I said, you're right. She's like, yeah, they're all very beautiful. And they all just learn in very different ways. And that term stuck with me. And I knew, honestly, it birthed something in me because I had been searching for what I was going to do when I did go back to work. I had stopped working, sort of like in the quotes, working for someone else, because I needed to figure out how my middle child could learn. And I had taken really a 5-year break really from, working in a school to figure out what I needed to do to support her. But I had been searching as she was going to embark on starting school, right? We were in virtual kindergarten, but the following year she would be in first grade and schools would be reopened. What was I going to do? Because I had learned so much in my time with her. So much about, I'm trying not to get emotional about this.
No, you're fine. This is real life for us.
Yeah, I had learned just so much about the capabilities of the human mind.
Mm-hmm.
I had learned so much about her hyperlexia. This was a child that had taught herself to read at age 2. I discovered through her nonverbalness that when we put flashcards with just words in front of her, she knew every single one of them. And this was, I mean, I even gave her 5th grade sight word cards in a therapy session, and she read every one of them unprompted, no help.
Mm-hmm.
But just getting her to look at a picture of a bear, for example, she could not tell us. Or just telling her to repeat something just auditorily, she couldn't do it. But when I had a hunch that was going on. And so I confirmed it when she was about 2.5 through a speech therapist, that this is what she's doing. And it just blew my mind, because everything that we typically know about how kids learn to read is that they learn speech sounds first, right? They learn phonemes and there's a certain order. But for her speaking came after she had learned to read. And she was doing that in her, you know, how we say sometimes kids on the spectrum, they go into their bubble, right? They're in their own quote unquote own world. And in that phase for her at age 2, that being in her own world, that's what she was doing. And then one day I could interact with her enough to realize she had learned to read. So I had just developed such a unique skill set with just watching her researching. And I just felt I couldn't go back into the traditional setting of what our schools typically expect schools to do. It just wasn't sitting right with me. So when my mother-in-law mentioned this term kaleidoscope, it struck something in me. And I also liked the idea that I was able to build really strong relationships with our immediate community, my neighbors. I mean, they know us well. Everybody in our neighborhood really knows us well. And all these stores, these Chuck E. Cheese, and all these places I'd been taking my kids, you know, since they were babies, just as, you know, me being a stay-at-home mom with them in my early years as a mom, and how much their support of knowing how neurodiverse my family was, when we would come to see them, they knew how to accommodate us or our learning needs. If we were there to learn one thing or another, they would allow us their space and give us, you know, if we were teaching Fariel to certain social norms like stand in line, they would be there to share their input on how we could teach her that while we were there. So that idea of collaboration really also resonated with me. So yeah, I started that, the name, the Kaleidoscope Collaborative, because of that experience. And when Fariel did start school and schools opened back up, and my 8-year-old, well, she's 9 now, but at the time when she was 8, my oldest started into school and had their evaluations, and we learned about the dyslexia, and you know, Fariel was already diagnosed. I realized they also needed the school, even our top ranked schools where my kids were attending, really still needed a lot of support with how to use what we know about how these children learn, and build into their lesson plans how to support them in a normalized way, right?
Yeah,
and so that's really the story of the work that I'm doing.
I love that. One, there's so many connections that I feel with your story. So, you know, as the listeners know, my oldest is autistic. And she's also hyperlexic, and we discovered that she could read at 3.
Wow.
And it was just because the TV was on a news station, on CNN, and they, you know how they have the little bottom screeners going across, and
Yeah.
she came in, walked by, read it, and kept on walking. And I was like, what? What are you? I was like, did you just read that? And she just, you know, was just completely going on about her thing. And then I just started putting other things out, and she would just read it. No issue, just read it and go on. And I'm like, who taught you to read? Is this something that you're doing at school, or what is going on here? Because I'm holding up ABC flashcards, and you're actually reading. At that time, she was reading, when we got her tested, on a 7th grade level. And I was just like, where did this come from? And, you know, I didn't understand the actual term of hyperlexic until maybe 3 years ago. We actually put a name to what she had been doing. We actually had the education and information of what was going on. So I know a lot of listeners, especially knowing that this is the Autism in Black podcast, because there is a overlap between autism and hyperlexia. Can you explain what hyperlexia is?
Yeah. So same for me. I was like, what the heck is this? When I just had this hunch. She started at about a year. Actually, we had rumblings of it at around early one, like 13 months, 14 months. I would have a mom every now and then tell me, we'd be at a play place, one of those indoor play areas, and one of the rooms might have magnetic letters. And I remember one time a mom coming out and saying to me, is that your daughter in the, so-and-so room with the letters? And I said, oh yeah, what's she doing now? I thought maybe she'd bitten somebody or something. She said, no, she's in there spelling words with the magnetic letters. And I said, is she doing that? I said, I felt like I was seeing her try to do that at home, but I wasn't sure. I'd have these rumblings of it, And when we confirmed it, with the speech therapist, because I told the speech therapist, look, I'm leaving her with you and I'm racing down to this Barnes and Noble. I'm going to get some note cards. I have a feeling this child's trying to learn to read. She keeps taking my hand and putting it on letters in her books and looking at me. Before I even got to the bookstore, she texted me, the speech therapist. It was like, OMG, that's all I saw in the heading. And she told me that, she had pulled out these cards, and like out of the 20 in the deck, Farrell had read like 16 of them unprompted. So I was like, what the heck is this? And I didn't know how to search for it. I was just putting all kinds of words in Google. And eventually found that term hyperlexia, and then found an organization, I believe they're in Chicago. You may have heard of them. They're called CHAT. And I forget what they stand for. I'll have it ready when we get to the conference. But in talking with, I had a consultant there with that organization, and the reading I could do, I've understood hyperlexia. They've explained it to me, at least in the sense of how Fariel was developing, as I could think of her as a child who, in her case, might have something like an auditory processing delay. But the part of her brain that is, if you're thinking about a pie, like the slice of her brain that was the largest was the area supporting like sort of vision. And so she's a very visual learner, more than typical learners might have sort of an even split in some of these ways of learning. For her, her visual capacity for learning, we could think of it as being a larger slice of the pie. And so that ability to decode symbols, whether those are letters, whether those are numbers, it comes much easier. And so it's not uncommon for a child with hyperlexia, of course, to be, very good with math, or even learning foreign languages on their own, seeing those symbols in conjunction with the sounds associated with them. They have a tendency to be able to understand how those sounds and symbols go together much easier. And I have come to also, in some ways, think of it as almost an opposite, perhaps, to dyslexia. And I won't go into the details of dyslexia, but I'll just sort of use that as a way to better explain it for those listeners who, do understand dyslexia. So for us, when we work on like an IEP for Fariel, an individual education plan for her, one of the things I have to sort of reiterate with people I'm partnering with to support her is that in her case, it's not just, I'll put in quotes, nice to have visuals for her work. She's a child who needs visuals in order to learn, and for her, in order to acquire language, because she had been largely nonverbal up until we discovered the hyperlexia. And I remember the day that speech therapist texted me with this, and I was like, I knew it. I went out, I got all those note cards, and I was putting things in her face. Read this, read this. I had video of it. I just couldn't believe it. But I started labeling everything in my house, because up to that point, I could tell her, okay, Fariel, go to mommy's room, go to daddy's room. And she had no idea what I was saying. But I remember the day she was at therapy, and when she came home, I had everything labeled. I had my bedroom door labeled, my husband's home office, the kitchen, the living room was labeled, living room. I had laminated everything. I put note cards or flashcards on the doors so she could ask to go outside and play, because she didn't know how to say any of that. And I remember the day she walked in, I brought her home from therapy, and she walked in, and she was 3 at this point, and she walked in and saw those cards and things around the house, and she walked up to the one on the front door that said, I want to go outside. And she read it, and she turned around and she looked at me, and I repeated back what she had said. I said, Fariel, you want to go outside? Because she had said it so clearly. And when she realized that I understood her, Maria, it was like somebody had opened the door to a caged bird.
Yes.
That's the look on her face, even as a 3-year-old, that she had been trapped and she was making these sounds and nobody could understand what she was saying. She felt she was saying things. We could not understand what she was saying until I put the text there for her to then recall how to say what maybe, most often she's only hearing with the auditory and not the visual support. And it changed everything for her. So that's my description of hyperlexia. And then once you understand that for a child, it's not a nice to have, it's a necessity that they be supported in that way of learning. And in our case, in that way of acquiring spoken language.
Yes. And similar to our daughter, but we also have an added component for her is that she can read with no issue, but there is a comprehension factor there at times for her. So she can read at the magnitude of, higher than in her grade level, per se, if we're putting it in terms of school. However, the comprehension may be slightly difficult for her. And this can be common with hyperlexia, especially when we're talking about, I think it's inferential comprehension. So seeing beyond the text. So for her, that is something that we work with her with in school. So that could be common with hyperlexia.
Yeah, it's definitely common.
And I know that you do a lot of work with universal design learning. So I do want to touch on that for this episode of the podcast. Can you talk about what universal design learning is?
I can. And I love this. And I really hope some of your listeners have already started to get wind of this. It's picking up a lot of traction. They've written, the acronym for it is UDL. They've written it into the sort of education code here in Ghana as well. I was very excited to learn that last year. But Universal Design for Learning is basically a framework for thinking about teaching and learning that matches universal design. So let me go back and talk about universal design. That is an architectural term that architects will use, right, when they're building structures or designing structures in which you want to give universal access. So meaning if you were to build, I don't know, let's just say a school building, you want to think about what features, structures need to be in that building to give the most amount of people access to the building. And so you will think about, let's say in the case of entryways into the building. So let's say there might be people who are going to use that school building who can't walk. So you try to think about perhaps the most marginalized group who would need access, groups that would need access to that building, maybe people with disabilities who can't walk. So what might they need? A ramp to get in. Maybe they might also need sliding doors, elevators, and so on. And so you put these design features into this building because if you can design for the groups that tend to have the least access, people who are not in those groups can also find those features useful. So think about it. When we go into any building, school building, library, whatever, although myself, for example, I'm not in a wheelchair, I could still use an elevator. Although it wasn't designed for me, I still find it useful because maybe I show up with a baby in a baby stroller and we can't use the stairs that particular day or for the duration that the baby's in the stroller. Thank God they universally designed the building that when I show up, I have access. Maybe you're temporarily in a wheelchair, but later you can use the stairs, right? So all those features have been built into the design. So you take that framework, and now we have an organization called CAST. I know they design technologies, basically. They design accessible technologies. I forget the name, the whole acronym, but CAST has developed this framework called UDL, placing that same mindset and framework into our teaching and learning. And so now when we're a teacher and we're thinking about our lesson plans, how do we design our learning experiences in a way that give the most amount of children access to the curriculum? access to the objectives, and what it brings you to think about. And it's based on, they based their framework on neuroscience. What do we now know through MRIs and other ways we can scan the human mind? What do we know about the diversity by which people learn? And you heard me just talk about, just how much I learned about my one child and her capacity as a visual learner, right? But we know that and much more through neuroscience that can inform this UDL framework. And so working with teachers to think about the different ways that people learn visually. Some people really need hands-on. I mean, these are not new ways of thinking about it, but now we're saying this is not, again, sort of something nice to do. We need to do this regularly. This needs to be normalized, this way of doing teaching, so to speak. And so UDL is a way of coaching and supporting schools, teachers, school leaders, and so on, to think about how they're organizing their buildings, their lesson plans, and so on, in a way that gives the most amount of diverse learners access to the curriculum.
I love that. And what I love about UDL is that it impacts every child, and especially what we know about our Black community is that a lot of our children do not get categorizations in the school system. So that means they may not have access to accommodations and modifications. But when we incorporate UDL, we are taking all of those children into consideration, which is going to make it more impactful for the students.
Yeah, and one of the things for me as an African-American mom, and I work with a lot of moms, a lot of parents, particularly mothers, in advocacy and advocating for their children in schools. And I'm also aware, even here being in Ghana, there's this stigma of, the social stigmas we have with many things, including disability. And in some cases, stigmas associated with being Black, right? Mm-hmm. That make certain people, and I'll say in my experience, even Black children, less likely to be considered as maybe having a learning disability.
Yes.
Maybe it's just an emotional disturbance or whatever all the other negative things you can associate to it, that in some sense and historically have dismissed schools from actually being responsible for really seeing what's happening here and how do we support and not criminalize. And so my work with moms with UDL, and I've done trainings for parents here in Ghana, and I've done trainings in the United States, is talking just about that. The tendency to criminalize rather than educate, and the importance of understanding UDL from the mindset of neuroscience, that this is fact. There are many different ways of learning. And the more you know about this framework, what it's based on, some of the terminologies associated with it, the more you start to look at your own children in that framework. And when you show up to an IEP meeting, you're empowered by that language in a way that is advocacy, right? And I think that advocacy is so important, particularly with children of color, Black and brown children, because we also, it is, and with most parents, but I think I'll say with most parents, it's also easy to assume the school knows best.
Yes.
Yes, it's easy to assume that, and especially when you, as the mom or dad, don't know the alternatives to what is being proposed about your child. And so, yeah, my work with UDL and the reason I think it's just such an empowering tool for parents of children of color, especially those with learning differences, is that it gives you that support, that empowerment, that language, that terminology to bring to that meeting and best make sure your child is seen for who he or she really is, that sometimes our institutions just don't take the time to do.
I love that. And Patrinia is actually speaking on universal design learning at the 3rd annual Autism in Black conference. And depending on when you are listening to this, you are either have the option of attending live with us April 28th through the 30th, or purchasing the replays to see this wonderful workshop. So we are very excited about that. And before we wrap up, is there anything that you want to leave the listeners with in regards to advocating or universal design learning?
I'm just going to encourage you, if you're listening, please sign up to attend this conference. There's a wealth of information for you to gain. There's the community for you to connect with. I have so much I would really love to share with you in detail about the ARD process or the IEP process and how to begin to empower you for that. I'm sure you also, as listeners, will have a lot of questions about universal design for learning. And that using that as an equity tool, that is really how I like to use universal design for learning. So I really just want to encourage you to show up and be involved. My work as a disability inclusion specialist, strategist, is not possible without community. I am a part of a very dynamic and strong group of mom advocates in Houston. And it makes such a difference knowing that when we're out here trying to make these spaces better for all kids, and including our own kids, that I'm not doing the work alone. And the way I have come to know that these people exist is by showing up to, conferences like yours, Maria, and others. And once we find each other as a tribe, we don't let go. We're friends for life. So yes, I would just encourage you to sign up, join, and you will walk away with more than you showed up with. I can guarantee that. And I'm just looking forward to getting to meet you all in person. I'll put that in quotes because I know it will be virtual, but a lot of my relationships because of COVID have been virtual relationships. And when I meet these people in person for the first time, I don't even realize it's for the first time. I mean, that's how strong the connection can be in this community. Yeah. So don't let the virtual aspect be a deterrent. Show up, come and get what is for you and for your child. And I'll just look forward to the day that we meet in the conference.
I absolutely love that. Also share your information about where the listeners can find you, your website, social media, so that they can also reach out and get some help as well.
Yeah, so I'm on LinkedIn. You can just put my first and last name, Patrinia Baksmaty. I'm on LinkedIn. I also have a website. We can maybe post it on the blog or something.
Yeah, it'll be in the show notes.
Okay, so that's www.thekaleidoscopecollab.org. And there's some resources there, some really great articles that parents, should read. I have a newsletter you can sign up for. So, feel free to find me there as well.
Perfect. And we will have all of that information in our show notes so that you all can connect with her. Thank you so much for being a guest on our podcast and being one of the speakers for the 3rd annual Autism in Black conference. We really appreciate you.
Yes, it's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you guys so much.
And thank you all for listening to another episode of the Autism in Black podcast. And we will see you at the next episode. If you haven't done so, make sure to subscribe to our podcast so you can always be notified when a new episode drops. To get the resources shared on today's podcast and the show notes, make sure to go to autisminblack.org/podcast. And be sure to share your takeaways from the show on IG stories and Twitter using our official hashtag AIBpod so that we can find them and share them. And if you want to continue the conversation from today's episode, make sure to join our Autism in Black podcast Facebook community. And please make sure to answer the questions to gain entry. Thank you for listening and joining me this week. Have a good one.